As a steel constructor, Bailey turned World War II rivers into roads and made speed the main weapon of the Allies, from Sangro to Remagen. War requires not only heroes, but also screwdrivers. In 1940, British sappers were puzzling over a trivial but deadly task: how to throw a column of tanks across a river when the enemy blew up every major bridge within a radius of hundreds of kilometers. Cranes are busy, beams are scarce, and time is zero. Against this background, pragmatic engineer Donald Bailey proposed a thing similar to a children's construction kit, only made of steel and without the right to make mistakes. The idea was obscenely simple: to make a set of standard panels and assemblies that can be manually connected to any length and under any load, from supply trucks to heavy Churchills. The panel farm has become the heart of the system. Each panel is a rectangular lattice section that is lifted by 2 or 3 people and fed into the assembly, where it is joined to the neighboring one through crossbars, horizontal elements that set the rigidity of the flooring, and through bolts, massive fingers that pass through the ears of the joints and fix the nodes without complicated fitting. Instead of welding, there are only bolts, fingers, and a sledgehammer. No exotic stuff. Universal holes, the same tolerances, 1 grammar for all cases. Hence the Lego effect. Panel to panel, bolt to bolt, and you have a farm growing like a construction site from childhood. Only now tanks will go through it in an hour. If you are really interested in these stories, please like and write in the comments where you are watching me from. And please watch the video to the end. The genius wasn't in new formulas for material resistance, but in scalability. The Bailey Bridge can be extended both in length and in load-bearing capacity. The basic package is single, 1 row of panels in height and width on each side of the farm. You need a large load capacity. You double the width of the section, getting a double, and then a triple. When even higher rigidity was required, the panels were placed in 2 tiers. The height superstructure increased the moment of inertia of the entire truss. It looked dry in the instructions, like magic in the field reports. Yesterday the ferry was holding trucks. Today it is dragging Churchills. No new factories, just more of the same panels. In order for the sappers to understand what the bridge is really capable of, the design was linked to the load classes. These are not abstract kilonewtons, but applied shortcuts. For example, the Class 40 is focused on medium tanks and heavy trucks. The Class 70 is on the most massive vehicles that the Allies drove at the end of the war. The class was set by a combination of configuration: single, double, triple, 1 or 2 tiers, span length, type of supports, and flooring quality. So the engineers got a common language. The commander was told, "We're putting double-double on Class 40." And he understood which cars and at what pace it was possible to drive through this miracle without risking turning the bridge into an expensive accordion. The secret of speed was hidden in the standardization of nodes and logistics. The Bailey kit was packed into truck bodies as exactly repeating sets. So many panels, so many crossbars, so many bolts, terminals, decking grills, support shoes. No unique details. Everything is interchangeable. There were dozens of identical boxes in the divisional park. In the field, this meant the simple truth: if you have people, light, and the flatness of the shore, the bridge will appear. Without cranes, without fuss, with only tactical operations that have been honed to automatism. One department supplies the panels, another sets up the crossbars, and the third lays the flooring and sides. The tempo is like on an assembly line, but accompanied by the sounds of artillery. Donald Bailey did not think in blueprints, but in a process. He understood that a frontline engineer has 3 enemies: time, chaos, and water. He set modularity against time, a single standard against chaos, flexibility of support schemes against water. The Bailey Bridge could rest on regular coastal pillars, on an embankment, on stone pillars of a blown-up bridge, and could float on pontoons when the width of the river left no chance for fast gantry supports. And it's all from the same details. This is not one bridge. This is the language in which the sappers spoke to the elements. In order for the scale of the work to be realistic, industrial replenishment was required. In 1942 to 1943, the British did not just rivet sets at home. They licensed production in the USA, where the industry was able to do a lot, and equally. American factories adopted the drawings and began to produce tons of panels and crossbars. And by the summer of 1944, Columns with Bailey boxes were rolling after the troops as inevitably as fuel trucks and ammunition. Licensing has solved the bottleneck problem. The design has become truly allied. One architecture, many manufacturers, a single format. At the supply level, this turned into a steady delivery rhythm. Divisional engineering companies did not receive hardware at all, but a complete set for standard configurations, which reduced errors and accelerated deployment. The field rhythm of the assembly was also standardized. First, exploration of the shores, depths and currents. Then, the choice of the scheme. How many panels are wide? Whether a second tier is needed? Which span is blocked in the air? Where we will put temporary supports. After that, the preparation of the rolling pad for the launching method. The farm was assembled on the shore, and adding sections, pushed through the water until the bow caught the support on the opposite shore. This saved hours and reduced the risk of riggers being shot at in the middle of the river. Finally, the laying of flooring, the installation of guardrails, the marking of traffic, and commissioning with a test column. In ideal conditions, an average platoon of sappers could lift a Class 40 ferry overnight with spans that seemed impossible without a crane yesterday. But theory is valuable only as far as practice confirms it. The first major exam was Tunis, November 1942. In North Africa, roads were cut by a network of seasonal rivers and canals, and retreating parts of the Axis were methodically blowing up crossings. British and Canadian sappers brought Bailey's experimental kit to a river whose banks promised nothing good. Soft soil, limited access roads, and enemy surveillance. And yet the modular logic worked. The panels were unloaded according to the scheme. The rolling platform was leveled, literally with shovels. The nose of the bridge was reinforced with an additional tier in order to remove horizontal loads during ejection. Opening hours, and first trucks with ammunition, then anti-tank tractors, and finally, medium tanks went through the new crossing. The African theater showed the main truth. If you can bring the boxes, you can build a bridge. Leonforte in Sicily, in the summer of 1943, was no longer a laboratory, but a battle for strength. The Canadian troops ran into a destroyed bridge under fire. The infantry held the bridgehead, but the equipment was stuck on the southern shore. It was impossible to stretch the heavy farm according to the textbook. Shelling, lack of shelters, narrow streets. Then the engineers went to engineering audacity. They reduced the subassembly, brought critical operations closer to the edge, organized a smokescreen and synchronized the thrust with artillery preparation. The bridge reached the required span and rested on the surviving stone support, after which the first truck immediately went to the deck. The best crash test that only happens. That day, Bailey's system proved another quality. It tolerates improvisation. When the design is extremely repeatable, you can change the stages without destroying the whole. Since then, Bailey has gained a reputation as a maneuver accelerator. Where before the army had stumbled over water and ruins, now it only changed gears. Sappers deployed crates, infantry cleaned the shore, tanks were adjusted to their original positions, and after a few hours the enemy water barrier turned into a stretch of road. From the point of view of operational art, it was a coup. Previously, deep rivers gave defenses a week's respite. Now it's night, at best. The enemy had less time to bring up reserves, deploy artillery, and regroup. The bridge has become a weapon of tempo. It's also important that Bailey didn't do it. He did not cancel the reconnaissance, did not defeat the currents alone, did not protect from an airstrike. He was a tool, extremely reliable, extremely understandable, and therefore beloved. The engineers spoke of him almost tenderly. The panels were not capricious. The bolts did not require jewelry precision. And if something went wrong, the solution usually lay within the same modules. This is a rare case in military technology, when the complexity of the system does not increase fragility, but reduces it. Ease of implementation was provided by educational simplicity. The assembly teams were trained like an orchestra. Score, rolls, shifts, checkpoints. The commanders knew how many people and vehicles were eating up one flight, what kind of panels were needed in case of miracles, how to organize one-way traffic so that the column did not stand on the approaches. Logically, it was a victory for rationality. One bridge means many scenarios. One nomenclature means many theaters of war. That's how the iron Lego revolution was born. Not an exquisite contraption for the sake of a contraption, but an engineering language that allowed maneuver to speak across rivers. In the next chapter, this language will be heard at full volume. In France, where the retreating enemy blew up bridges faster than they could compile reports, and the sappers responded with a patter of panels, crossbars, and bolts, overtaking the retreat as inevitably as the tide drives foam to the shore. By the middle of August 1944, the Normandy front had moved so dramatically that the map was no longer a static thing. After the break at Falaise, the Allied motorized columns broke away from the short, brisk stage of fighting for the sides and the road, to a long, nervous race to the Seine. The Wehrmacht left as usual, leaving behind a desert of bridges. The spans were torn, the abutments were mined, the straits were filled with farms and barges. Water is the best brake for the pursuer, but this time, the water was stopped faster than it had time to calm down after the explosions. The logic of the German withdrawal can be described in 3 verbs: blow up, set on fire, mine. Bridges over all significant watercourses between the Our, Diva, Tuc, Rizel were destroyed, and then the Seine with its many water arms and high banks. It was not a chaotic malice, but a system. In the engineering journals of the Germans, there were notes about charges in the support chambers, about pre-prepared wicks, about barriers at entrances, where even 100 meters of a well-maintained highway turned into an anti-tank task. The Allies responded with their own system: speed. The Baileys and pontoons moved not somewhere behind, but almost in combat formations. Platoons of sappers spent the night on wheels. Road crews with white batons worked like street conductors. Column, pause, column. Without musical phrases, but with the utmost discipline. There are 3 main fans of routes to the Seine. The first was the northern one, for the British Corps, through Lisieux and Pont-l'Evêque to the upstream, where good roads led to the river, and where it was possible to play with the width of the offensive. The second was the central one, towards Vernon and Mantoue, where the coastal platforms made it possible to push Bailey farms from the rolling ramps and catch them on the surviving abutments. The third was further south, in the zone of the Americans, to the Seine at Melun and Montereau, where long pontoon threads and the rapid guidance of treadways, floating bridges with metal flooring, were key. The task was formulated the same way everywhere. The bridge was needed yesterday, and the road to it was needed the day before yesterday. The pace of assembly was set not by the numbers in the instructions, but by the breath of battle. A typical rhythm on the Seine looked like this. During the day, exploration of the shores, soundings, search for surviving supports, bulldozing entrances. In the evening, removal of rolling frames, marking with hangers, lifting pontoons. After dark, the main assembly of the farm, in smoke and under rare breaks on distant approaches. By dawn, the bridge should be alive. If not to live, then at least to breathe. That is, to withstand the test cart and the first truck. In reality, sometimes they fit into one day, the assembly of the single farm in 2 tiers, flooring, railings, a control passage, and by noon the next day there was a column of tanks, fuel, artillery. Other crossings required 2 nights, especially where they built a double farm or a long floating section with anchor lines against the current. Organizational tricks were solved no less than steel. First, there were night entrances. Large trains with panels and crossbars fitted into quiet windows, synchronized with artillery firing. Secondly, smoke screens. On the Seine, the smoke was not a theatrical set, but a full-fledged working tool. Smoke engines pulled the cloth along the riverbed, covering the nose of the farm at the moment of ejection. Tugs with pontoons also moved under the curtain. Thirdly, priority modes. Immediately after the surrender, the crossing did not turn into a shockless highway. The military police established cycles where breakthrough tanks with cover went first, then fuel, then towed and self-propelled artillery, then repair facilities, and only after that long supply tails. Any attempt to jump over the queue could physically block the canvas and disrupt the pace of the persecution for a day. A special case is crossing where infantry was already working on the other side. The scheme looked like a reverse gluing. Assault crossings on boats and assault rafts captured tiny bridgeheads, then light treadways rolled onto them, and a heavy Bailey farm was pulled nearby. This made it possible not to wait for ideal conditions, and not to depend on the surviving pillars. Where the support remained, it was stripped of debris. Undershoes were put on. The axle was checked, and the farm followed the old trail, saving spans. Where the support was sinking, A chain of pontoons with anchors upstream, and a pair of safety nets below was built on the stream. Everywhere, the solutions remained within the same boxes with panels. The role of road junctions. Temporary junctions at the heads of bridges cannot be overestimated. The ferry itself is only half of the miracle. If a narrow street or mud bottleneck runs up against it, the pace burns out. Therefore, along with the farm, the infrastructure grew. An embankment made of broken bricks, water drainage into ditches, wooden crossbars in the ruts, turnaround areas for tractors, and places for brief refueling. These nodes looked modest, but worked as speed multipliers. The military police set up signs and introduced one-way traffic for several kilometers before and after the bridge, so that the columns would not collide nose to nose and turn the engineering triumph into a standing lake of cars. The psychological effect of the rhythm proved to be almost as devastating to the German defense as the artillery. The Wehrmacht's plan suggested that the river would give at least a couple of days to organize the line, raise divisional artillery, and set up anti-tank ambushes. When the bridges stood up through the night, the defenses on the west bank of the Seine did not have time to grab. The bridgeheads expanded, the flanks cracked, and by the August exoduses, the lines on the map curved not along the river, but across the river. The Allied formations found themselves not in front of the water, but already behind it, when with fuel, trucks, repairmen, and ammunition. The broken logic of the withdrawal was collapsing. The separation did not work. The reserves had nowhere to fight, and the artillery had to be positioned at comfortable ranges. A separate page is the port triangle at the mouth. The Germans hoped to hold the fortress's ports of the canal coast as supply plugs. But the operational picture after the Seine crossings made them less and less viable. When the tank and infantry divisions, having slipped over temporary bridges and treadways, hung on the enemy's communications already east of the river, the isolation of the coast became a matter of days. This directly rhymed with the siege of Le Havre. The pace of ferry crossings and the organization of flows into the depths broke the enemy's port calculation, turning fortified urban hubs into pockets that are easier to block than to save. The reality of crossings is also the price tag of fatigue. The sappers worked on the edge. Night shifts, the monotony of bolts and bolts, mud, water, rare mortar hits, and blind shelling by the noise of winches. To survive, the parts were pre-processed by microprocesses. Who feeds the panel? Who sets the bolt? Who checks the fingers? Who is responsible for the nose area? Who is responsible for the flooring? The commanders made sure that people ate and slept cyclically, and not, as it turns out. This pedantry made magic possible. Solid geometry was born from identical tin boxes in black smoke, and 30-ton cars rolled along it. On the practical side, the August cycle Seine Bridge bridgehead provided two main lessons. First, tempo engineering is not after the battle, but instead of stagnation. When every day brings a couple of new crossings, operational solutions multiply. You can bypass nodes, reduce pincers, and impose undesirable distances on the enemy. Second, unification saves. One panel type, one assembly logic, and one load class terminology allowed mixed groups from different armies and corps to operate as one school. Hence, the reliability of plans is a rare thing for the war. If the summary said, by morning, class 40, it usually meant exactly that. Photos of those days are a separate chronicle. They show how the nose of the farm emerges from the smoke gauze, how a truck with panels in reverse delivers packages to the edge of the rolling road, how the military police, standing on barrels, launch another dozen tanks with a wave of their hands, how neat stacks of crossbars and decking lie on the shore, and next to it is a dump of a destroyed old bridge. The diagrams of the temporary nodes show simple mathematics. The width of the canvas, the radii of turns, the angles of entry, and the points of departure. Nothing heroic, except the result. The outcome of the August race is simple and ruthless. The defense on the west bank of the Seine has been disrupted. What was supposed to take weeks has shrunk to a few days. When the columns passed the river, the port fortresses lost their meaning, and the enemy's plan to catch his breath crumbled. The fall of Le Havre was a symptom not of local weakness, but of strategic fatigue of the system, which was not allowed to work. Its water brakes were no longer slowing down. The engineers, whose fame is usually quieter than artillery salutes, did their main thing. They gave the maneuver time, and time is always short. In this shortage, a turning point was born. which is usually written about dryly in staff reports, but which in fact smelled of smoke, river dampness, and the hot metal of newly tightened bolts. There are tasks where the best bridge is the one that already stands. In September 1944, at Nijmegen and Arnhem, this is not a figure of speech but a strategy. Operation Market Garden was conceived as a rapid multi-stage combination. The aerial capture of bridges over the Meuse, Wall, and Lower Rhine, and an almost instantaneous connection with a ground group to prevent the enemy from blowing up the spans or deploying defenses. Any delay at the water turned the offensive arrow into a blunt stick. That's why Bailey, the miracle of modular engineering, suddenly turned out to be not the main character. Not because he became bad, but because geometry and fire made his strengths secondary. Let's look at the map without romance. In Nijmegen, Ball spreads widely and gloatingly. The riverbed is not one but two, an arm, an island, and a second arm. The total width of the crossing is hundreds of meters of water plus embankments, bridge trusses, and railway approaches. The current is brisk, the coastline is built up, and at the far edge, there are German dots covered with flak batteries. Even if you assemble a Bailey farm for a textbook, you need to extend it with a long console from the rolling platform, catch it on the surviving supports, or put a floating thread on pontoons. Keep it anchored against the jet and at the same time, live under a targeted sky. For a quick night and done, this is too much advertising. Real hours would add up to days, and days would be worth the entire operation. Arnhem is even tougher. The lower Rhine here is not so much wide as inconvenient. High embankments, difficult approaches, urban development, firing fields that shoot through the future construction site like a shooting range. Any engineering layout depends on one thing. To get started, you need to have a foothold on the North Shore and silence overhead. The ground group was not guaranteed to have either. The enemy's artillery, reinforced with anti-aircraft guns in the anti-aircraft field mode, would have torn off the mounting windows. The Allied aircraft could not indefinitely keep the ceiling above the point, because at the same time there were battles at Nijmegen, along the routes of the columns, and on the approaches to Eindhoven. In this geometry, let's collect the Bailey and move on, turned into, let's collect the target and pay for it. Hence the key conclusion of the headquarters. The capture of intact arch bridges is more important than any assembly. The arch is not only beautiful. This is the aluminum of the time. Ready-made load capacity, correct height, verified approaches, width of the web, proven over years of operation. Columns can be launched immediately on such bridges, and engineering units are limited only to explosion protection and quick inspection of spans. That's why the paratroopers fought for entire flights as the heart of the operation. They were the heart. If the heart is beating, the 30th Corps will skip. If not, at least fill up the panels. A traffic jam will be born on the river. Nijmegen has become a classic lesson. While the British and the Guardsmen were trying to push through the southern approaches to the road and railway bridges, the Americans from the 504th Parachute Regiment were preparing an assault on Ball in folding boats. It looked almost anachronistic against the background of modular wonders. Lightweight wooden canvas assault boats, outboard motors, rowing with a propeller and oar. Minimal armor. In reality, it was necessary. First, blood and a foothold, then bridges. The boats were torn apart by machine guns and flasks. The current turned them sideways to the fire. The engines stalled, but wave after wave of infantry got out to the North Shore, crawled along the dams and bit the defenses at the supports. When the northern abutments were taken, the road bridge ceased to be a German valve. It was then that the Guards were able to break into the track from the south, straighten the traffic jam, and finally let the cars in. Where are the engineers in all this? Everywhere. Engineering companies not only supplied boats and engines, they built and protected approaches, uncovered smoke generators, laid temporary decks on dams, pulled boats for the return trip through the viscous coastal mud. Their officers calculated the drift by eye and selected the starting points so that the infantry, conveyor belt, did not shift to one sector and did not form an accordion under heavy fire. They also extinguished accidental fires on the southern shore, from sparks, from accidental hits, because any fire raised a warm column, illuminated the ferry, and negated the smokescreen. On paper, someone always suggested, let's put a floating Bailey. There are also pontoons and motorboats to support it, the so-called Bailey boats. In practice, it sounded logical until the first targeted salvo. A floating Bailey is a wonderful thing when you have at least relative silence. normal anchor points, and a place for tugboats to maneuver. There were none on Ball. The width, the current, the direct shots from the North Shore, and the lack of a ready-made beachhead turned the floating farm into a target that was picked up by the jet and dragged into the fairway, while the people on deck caught the balance between physics and ballistics. In addition, the assembly itself took time. The sections needed to be connected to the pontoons, the tripwires synchronized, the bow and stern adjusted to the wave from shots and wind. In a situation of, we need a bridge now, otherwise everything is a luxury. The limits of engineering were also evident in Arnhem. The forces of the landing force holding the Northern Territory were enough for heroism, but not for a long-term defense of a decent scale. The ground column was stuck at the previous knots. Every hour turned into a meaningless argument with geography. As soon as it became clear that the Arnhem Arch Bridge would not be hours on time, all options with temporary crossings lost their meaning. The Bailey assembled under fire would not create the pace for which the operation was being planned. It takes too long, too hard, too expensive in lives, to win minutes where hours are needed on the march. It is useful to separate two concepts here: an engineering tool and an operational idea. Bailey is a tool, best in its class, smart, fast, and well-oiled. But a tool will become a solution only when the very idea of an offensive allows time for its application. The market garden was conceived as a leap up the ready-made steps. If the steps are not your handiwork, but a trivial no, trying to build them on the fly is another operation. And it does not fit into a 2-day corridor along Dutch roads between canals and dams. This does not mean that Bailey disappeared from Holland. It was installed on secondary branches. Damaged approaches were repaired. Narrow bridges across canals were replaced, and local congestion was resolved. Engineering units pulled treadways, light floating bridges for trucks and cannons, in areas where the enemy was pushed back for kilometers. Folding boats, FBE, and powerful storm boats were used for repeated flights through the Baal when the beachhead was expanded and the fire subsided. There were even improvised ferries based on Bailey pontoons to transfer repair vehicles and ammunition when the road bridge was still clogged with tanks. But this is all an accompaniment to the main plot, not its denouement. The moral is simple and sober. Bailey is not magic. This is a brilliant tempo booster if you have minimal initial conditions: a foothold, cover, windows of silence, road approaches. Where these conditions do not exist, the bridge turns into an expensive wish. In Nijmegen and Arnhem, engineering honestly showed its limits and thereby saved people from the worst mistake: the belief that iron can cancel physics and the module can be ahead of time. The real speed wasn't born out of boxes, but out of the decision to storm the river right now, at the cost of boats, engines, and the ridiculous vulnerability of infantry on the water. When the bridgehead was taken, engineering became king again. Strengthened, expanded, adjusted flows. But the first brick was laid not by farms, but by paddles. Paradoxically, this is where Bailey's design wins respect. A good tool is one that allows you to say no at the wrong moment. The bridge designers taught the headquarters to think not only how to assemble, but also when not to assemble. This is maturity. It was expensive in the Dutch campaign, but it became a lesson for the future. Where the enemy holds the far shore, where width and fire make water stronger than concrete, you must first change the geometry of the battle, and only then get the panels and bolts out of the body. And when the geometry changes, Bailey, as always, will do his job, quickly, smoothly, and without fuss. The next chapter will show how it looked where nature has a longer shoulder than artillery, in Italy and Burma, where modular logic learned to be friends with mountains, tropics, and rivers that flow as if to spite tactics. If Normandy taught bridges to run fast, then Italy taught them to climb, and Burma taught them to swim, and not sink in a season when the atmosphere itself is water. Bailey survived both because he is not a single bridge, but a language that can be spoken to any geography. Mountains understand rigidity and supports. Plains understand the pace of columns. Tropics understand pontoons and anchors. Versatility is not written in the product's passport. It is proved by kilometers of flooring and thousands of bolts, twisted until they ring. Italy began with the Sangro River, late autumn of 1943. A sharp coast, sticky pebbles, a cold wind from the Adriatic, and German explosions in every second flight. The textbook says, prepare the rolling platform, extend the farm. On the shore, The answer is more complicated. Where Comrade Bulldozer pecks his nose into the pebbles, where Comrade Pontoon tears off the anchor with a stream, where Comrade Sapper freezes in the water up to his chest, picking up the nose to the surviving abutment. Sangro became the beginning of Italian arithmetic, river after river, as if in a notebook with cells. Trento, Garigliano, Volturno, later the Tiber, and finally, the broad shoulders of Po. The logic is the same everywhere. Explosion, inspection, subassembly, ejection, decking, insertion. If the shore is low, they raise it on embankments. If the shore is stone, they wash the supports and put under the farm shoes. If it flows too vigorously, they fasten the bow ties higher up the stream so that the farm does not turn sideways. The mountains gave another test. The Apennines. Here, rivers are not only water, but also ravines, where yesterday there was a stream, and today there is a road with a landslide. Long-range artillery and tanks could only march in a ribbon, and each ribbon break killed the pace. Bailey became a stapler. Sappers learned how to put short spans through stone teeth, build up trusses in 2 tiers, through double and triple to withstand tractors with howitzers, and combine supports. 1 foot on an ancient arch, the other on a gantry rack, the third on a mound of rubble. Sometimes the bridge was not built along the river, but across a mountain crack, where any rain turned the road into mud. Then it was the flooring that decided. Planks and steel grills laid at 0, and sides so that heavy Churchills would not fall into side ditches on narrow streamers. The Po Valley is already a geometry of scales. The important thing here is not so much the flights as the continuity of the route. A column without pauses is the oxygen of the offensive. In order not to suffocate, the engineers brought the bridges into a system. Each head unit has a turnaround area, pockets for repairs, temporary embankment dams, detours of mud traps. 1. Sided markings for several kilometers on the sides. Bailey closed a large watershed in several places at once, and the artillery, like an honest cynic, did not wait. It rode because it knew that something from the familiar boxes would be ahead. The Italian campaign created a rare feeling for the war. Logistical calm. The panels or the crossbars are the same. The names of the configurations are the same. Even when your unit changed the body in the front, you spoke the same engineering dialect. That's how the artillery always managed to get to the tanks, and the tanks to the infantry. Italy has taught us how to work with the weather as another enemy. The rains knocked down the rolling pads, froze the bolts, washed away the banks under the supports. The answer was micro-solutions. Laying fascines under the flooring, carpets of sleepers on the entrances, drains so that water does not turn the entrance into a swamp, frequent inspection of the bolts and tightening of the nodes after the first. Columns. The load class on paper is one thing. The class after the fact, after a night shower, is another. On-site engineers lowered the standard, conditional class 40, to -1. Limited the mass of single vehicles. Introduced interval schedules. 1 tank with a pause, then a package of trucks, then a tank again. The bridge is not a dogma. The bridge is a regime. Fast forward to the east, where Burma has sadly grinned at all European habits. Chindwin and Irrawaddy are not just a width. They are a moving horizontal. The current bends the pontoons. The wind pulls the flooring. The shores crawl when the water washes away the clay from below. And at the same time, you need a long, floating bailey. In the textbook, it is drawn like this. Pontoon, farm, string stretching on anchors, compensation for rising, falling water levels. In reality, it's a dance. Anchor lines are carried upstream, and steel slings are kept with a tail in case of a sudden rise in water at night. The nose has reinforced pontoons and additional crossbars to dampen the shockwave from passing boats. The installation takes place not by the clock, but by the weather. When the wind has died down, when the storm has gone into the jungle, when the current is half a knot weaker. It wasn't just steel that tested the Burmese climate. The flooring swelled from humidity. The boards changed their geometry, and the bolts bloomed. Lubricants, impregnations, and spare slats were used. Inspections were carried out more often than usual. After each large column, a bypass, a lift, the replacement of a pair of boards that had led. The load class was recalculated under the stream. If on paper the farm holds a medium tank, but in reality the pontoons play on keeling. Then restrictions were introduced. The speed of the column was lower. The distances were greater. The mass of transport without surprises, like an overloaded tanker. Sometimes the bridge was not lowered, but made wider. Twin lane through an additional string of pontoons in order to reduce the dynamic load on each lane, and not spend a day completely closing for tension repairs. Burma has also set records for length, where the shores are too far away and the bottom is too capricious for supports. Hundreds of meters of floating farm were assembled. The anchors were set up like a Christmas tree. The main keel was on heavy cats. The side ones were on smaller ones so as not to be blown away by lateral thrust. Safety anchors were kept downstream so that the bridge would not float freely if the upper system broke down in a thunderstorm. The tugboats worked like shepherds. They adjusted the live line of the bridge against the wind and the jet, preventing it from bending into a dangerous arc. The sappers lived on the water for weeks, not for the sake of romance, but because every anchor change is an operation where the loss of an hour turns the bridge into a wandering headache. Interaction with local resources proved to be particularly valuable in Chindwin and Irrawaddy, where there were not enough regular pontoons, boats, barges, and even bamboo rafts were used as temporary pads for installation. Where the shore knitted wheels, bamboo shields were made for crushed stone, turning the jungle muck into a solid platform. Bailey did not require exoticism, but allowed for improvisation. Any floating object with sufficient buoyancy could become an assembly table for an hour or two, as long as the iron eventually found the iron and the bolts found their holes. Many people like to ask, what about artillery and tanks at such distances? Won't the floating farm kill the volley? The practitioner's answer was dry. Modes and rhythm. Artillery. Windows of passage in batches so that the fluctuations fit into the predicted amplitude. Tanks. Single passage without stops, with waiting points brought ashore. The military police turned into conductors, and the engineers into instrument tuners, where the note C is the tension of the anchor lines, and Fa is the interval between the machines. Burma taught the whole theater to respect the dynamics of the load, not just the static sign in the instructions. What unites Sangro and Irrawaddy? Consistency. The same set of panels and crossbars worked under different skies, because it wasn't the details that changed, but the combinations. In Italy, there are more gantry supports, higher rigidity, shorter spans. But there are many in a row. In Burma, there are long floating lines, anchor fields, flexible adjustment of the load class day and night. In both cases, speed was decided not by records but by the reliability of repetition. When the 10th bridge in a month is assembled like the first, the headquarters stops thinking, will it work? And starts thinking, whereafter? These are the long shoulders of war, a technical routine stretched over a map and time. Bailey's versatility is not a slogan, but a practical compromise. The design is simple enough to be assembled by tired people in bad weather, and flexible enough to accept the dictates of the terrain. It can be taught, copied, scaled. The panels are placed on snow, pebbles, and bamboo. Crossbars are carried on shoulders and winches. Bolts are placed with a sledgehammer in the rain. There is strength in this calmness. As long as the army is able to do the same thing well, geography can be any strange. And then the artillery will not lag behind the tanks from the infantry, and the supplies from all at once. Italy has proved that a bridge can be insurance against the terrain. Burma, that a bridge can be insurance against the climate. In sum, they give a simple thesis. Bailey is not a temporary crutch, but a steady way to keep up the pace in any theater. Because the war is won, not only on the front line, but also in those places where the river turns into a road overnight, and several hundred identical parts. Sometimes the war boils down to a single traffic task: how to stop standing and drive again. On the Rhine in the spring of 1945, it was literally a matter of pace survival. Ludendorff-Brücke, captured on March 7 from Remagen, became a miracle and a curse at the same time. Miraculously, because an entire arched bridge over the main German river gave the Allies an immediate crossing. Damn it, because the bridge was scarred, its iron groaned under the traffic, and the coastal approaches swelled into multi-kilometer traffic jams. When the spans turned into water on March 17th, it became clear. Either engineering would instantly find a replacement, or the strategic rhythm would choke at the very threshold of the Ruhr. The answer was born not out of pathos, but out of discipline. There were already pontoons and treadways on the southern shore, which took over part of the stream. but they lacked the carrying capacity to confidently drive heavy tractors and tanks. The solution is a Class 40 floating Bailey. It's not just the same bridge on pontoons. It's a strict bundle. Trusses of familiar panels stacked in the right configuration. Floating supports designed for a harvester jet. Anchor fields upstream. Bow reinforcements against the shockwave. And careful telephony of the traffic flow. Who, when, and from what distance. The engineering battalion deployed the assembly as on an assembly line. The sections were assembled on the shore, docked with pontoons, pushed the nose into the jet, and taken to the main keel. In the morning it was still almost a bridge. In the evening it was already a road through the water. It was not the assembly itself that was critical, but the decoupling effect. Ludendorff trousers, with their emergency capriciousness, gave a narrow neck. The floating Bailey parallelized the flow. One lane for tanks, another for fuel and ammunition, and the third for ambulances and repair vehicles. The military police turned the crossing into a metronome. Intervals between tanks, packs of trucks, windows for artillery, tugboats, shepherds, were rushing on the water, adjusting the living farm against the wind. Winches were working on the anchor lines. They equalized the tension after each heavy passage. There was no secret ingredient, just the ruthless persistence of standards. But it was she who provided strategic oxygen. The northern coast was filled with fuel and shells, and tanks turned kilometers into hours again. Remagen was the culmination, not because it is the most beautiful episode, but because for the first time all the advantages of Bailey converged here on such a scale. A module that is not afraid of the river. A load class that tells the headquarters the truth. Logistics. Able to deliver the same hardware for different tasks. Training. Turned into a reflex. The spring of the pursuit was based on this reflex. The Rhine, conceived as a giant break, turned out to be just a long puddle with proper engineering. Then there were long meters, bridges, novels, where the plot consists of hundreds of meters of a repeating line. The Canadians built a giant ferry near Rice, nicknamed Blackfriars, and it was not a lyric, but an accounting of steel panels. Each span is like another paragraph. Each anchor line is like punctuation, preventing the text from spreading. A long Bailey is a separate profession. The wear of pontoons is inspected daily. The tension of the side extensions is kept within narrow corridors. In case of flooding, the line is reconfigured from night to night, so that it does not bend in a dangerous arc and does not take the flooring and cars with it. The only thing that works is repeatable. The same crossbars, the same bolts, the same gestures of a sapper with a sledgehammer. Repetition makes a reliable highway out of a long gauge, not a record for the sake of a record. When the cannonade subsided, the bridge did not disappear. Bailey's legacy is not a museum stand, but a whole family of descendants. The British medium girder bridge has inherited the iron-in-a-box philosophy. Lighter panels, new locks, higher specific stiffness. At the training ground, he was assembled in platoons in the same way as his grandfathers assembled Baileys, one by one, wearing gloves, with the same rhythm of served, inserted, scored. Civilian relatives also appeared. Acro and Maybe turned the military idea into a universal tool for peaceful disasters. A flood swept away a bridge on a highway, and a temporary span of modules rises in a day or two. The construction site has blocked the highway. Wedges, panels, flooring, and traffic is breathing again. The post-war world inherited from the front not a love of steel, but a love of time that should not be wasted. The more the world got used to this logic, the more important it became to standardize the load language. Yesterday it was Class 40 or Class 70. Today it is MLC according to NATO standards. But the point is the same. The commander does not need a novel. He needs a short truth. What mass and at what speed can be driven along this span, at such a temperature, with such a wind and with such humidity? This, talking in numbers, is Bailey's direct heir. He disciplines decisions and saves lives. Every time you see a sign at a temporary ferry with restrictions on tonnage and distance between cars, know that this is not a bureaucracy. It is a memory of the tiny ledges on which the pins stand. Remagen also taught a lesson about the speed of decision-making under fire. No one was comfortable building a floating Bailey on the river, where the historic bridge had sunk to the bottom an hour ago. But the engineering staff did not look into the past, but into the table. Current, width, available pontoons, manpower, time of day, wind forecast. From these 6 values, a simple fork was born. Assembly, now. Launch, at dawn. Priority, tanks singly, trucks in batches. Repair window, every 6 hours. This is Bailey's case. Not the charm of technology, but a culture of choice, in which the best is considered not the most beautiful, but the most repeatable path to the goal. Where feelings are in dispute, procedures win. Bridges after continued to live a biography on the world map. They were taken to Africa for humanitarian operations, laid across rain-washed roads in Asia, lifted on poles in the mountains, where landslides ate up streamers. In each case, invariance saved. A set of identical boxes that can be interpreted locally. In this sense, Bailey has become a rare example of engineering that does not have a wrong theater. It is equally relevant in a war, on a construction site, at a bridge builders festival, in a report from the Ministry of Transport, and in a pocket memo from a prefect whose road went down in the rain. Universality has ceased to be a slogan and has become a delivery practice. And yet there is a quiet ethic in this story. Bailey is about respecting reality. He doesn't promise the impossible. He won't fly over the river. He won't beat the storm. He won't undo the clay. He only gives an honest advantage to someone who knows how to count and keep the rhythm. This is his moral beauty. When people hammered pins and leveled pontoons in waist-deep icy water near Remagen, they were not making romance, but a concrete future. The columns would march. The offensive would not suffocate. The war would shorten. This pragmatism is the humanism of engineering. Therefore, Remagen and After is not about one bridge, even if it is legendary. It's about a system where the right tool changes the dynamics of an entire front at the right hour. About a school that teaches you to look at a map through the eyes of workload and time. It's about simple but honest decisions that, repeated hundreds of times, become a strategy. And if you ever see in a photograph a long steel truss on the water, studded with anchor cables, know that this is not just a technique. You have a culture of acting quickly, without hysteria, and without tricks, like when the Rhine was still trying to be a wall, but remained a road.